Junghart. I am Manager Advisor for Disaster Risk Management at Helvetia Swiss Intercorporation, and I will be the host for today's webinar. I'm very excited to sharing the next hour or so, between 60 and 90 minutes, we will see, with you. And so today, this is already the second webinar that the Swiss NGO DRR Platform is hosting with regard to the IPCC report, the current cycle, the 6th assessment cycle. So we had one webinar in October where we had where findings were shared from the first working group on the physical science basis. And today, we are very glad to welcome a number of speakers and lead authors of the report of the second working group, Impact, Vulnerability and Adaptation. And we are aiming to help translating the findings of the scientific report for development and for humanitarian practitioners. Before we get started with the content, so first some technical tips: that your microphone is muted by default. And if you have questions, also given the number of participants, we ask you to directly post them in the chat. And we have allocated time during several sessions to address them. If you cannot hear or see us, then our practice shows that closing and restarting the webinar, closing other programs helps. We are, of course, recording the webinar, and it will be shared via the DRR Platform website. We also ask you to have your mobile phone at hand, not look at it during the webinar, but only if we say so, to access a Menti survey. Today's program, I quickly go through it, will start with a welcome and introduction by me, and we will then hear from Professor Christian Huggel, the key messages of the report, have time for a first round of Q&A, and then do a deep dive into the cross-chapter paper on mountains with two distinguished speakers from the Mountain Research Initiatives and the University of Zurich, Carolina Adler and Veruska Muccione. We have more time then for interaction and Q&A. And one change that is due to the current pandemic situation we are finding ourselves in, the planned input on climate resilient development pathways that my colleague Rupa Mukherjee was planning to give, has to be cancelled. So she tries to be present in the meeting to answer questions related to this, but there's no possibility for her to give this presentation today due to COVID. So we hope she gets well soon, and once she has recovered and there is interest in this topic, and I imagine there is, we will try to find another slot to discuss with you on this topic. I said that I will be hosting or guiding you through this webinar today. Jana Junghart from Helvetia Swiss Intercorporation, working as DRM advisor. But I'm not here only in my function as advisor with Helvetia. I'm also here in my function as core group member of the Swiss NGO DRR Platform, the host of today's meeting. So the DRR Platform is a network of 20 Swiss-based NGOs, and we are working towards increasing the resilience of women and men, communities and governments through an integrated approach to disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. And this is also where we see the importance of sharing and translating the findings of such an important report like the IPCC to a more practice-oriented audience of development and humanitarian practitioners. Our work builds on capacity building and exchange through such events, but of course also face-to-face, tool and concept development for increased quality in our work related to disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation, but also policy dialogue and advocacy, where we want to encourage our members and our partners to speak up and strengthen the voice for an inclusive disaster risk reduction and resilience building. So if you're interested in learning more about us, the Swiss NGO DRR Platform, please visit our website. And before we go into a brief recap of last webinar, and then we are going to hear from Christian the key messages of the latest report, we ask you to go to menti.com, either with your mobile phones or your laptop, and use the code that Gloria has entered into the chat. So 94310334. And here we are going to ask you one question, and that's before you hear anything from us today that's related to the report. What should be the priorities for effective adaptation, according to you? You can just enter simple keywords or short phrases, and this will create us a word cloud where we also get a sense of where you see the priorities. Okay, I see that we start to receive some replies, but we will not share the results just now. We will keep them for a bit later after the presentations. And you can continue submitting them, but we will see them just in a bit. Okay, so while you might still think about some ideas that pop up or findings that you have already seen when the IPCC, the latest report, was published, I just would like to give an overview that we also shared in the last webinar that share, let's say, that is an overview of the IPCC reports, the different reports in this current assessment cycle, because it is not only the working group reports, which, I mean, in itself are huge publications. So the Working Group 1 report, which covered the physical science basis from last year, the current Working Group 2 report, and the upcoming Working Group 3 report, which will then look at the mitigation of climate change due later this month. And then, of course, the synthesis report due this fall. But also the special reports that are commissioned by member states. So highlighting the special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees that was commissioned right after the Paris Agreement. And then in 2019, two special reports, one on the oceans and cryosphere, where also one of our speakers has contributed to, and the special report on climate change and land. So the whole assessment report cycle comprises the working group reports, and the working groups, let's say the focus remains the same, while the current IPCC report, or the current report of the Working Group 2, has a lot of insights regarding adaptation options that has a much stronger focus towards development. But our colleagues will share more about that. It's also important that there are these special reports that inform also the work of the working groups. And speaking of the working group reports, so what did we discuss in the first webinar of this series that we held in October 2021 with Professor Seneviratne from the ETH in Zurich? She's lead author of the chapter on climate extremes, and she shared with us the following insights. The warming is unprecedented. That the warming rate that we are witnessing is unprecedented in more than 2,000 years, and current temperatures levels, so this 1.1 degree Celsius rise compared to pre-industrial levels, are unprecedented in more than 100,000 years. And it leads to an unequivocal conclusion that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land. So this is a fact. It is not an assumption, it is a fact that what we are witnessing is, to a large majority, in the report it states 98% responsible for global warming. And no region is spared by climate change and its extreme events. So increased frequency and intensity of hot events is virtually certain, as well as marine heat waves. Frequency and intensity of heavy precipitation events over most land areas is also increasing, as well as the risk for agricultural and ecological drought across region, not across drought. Also, we witness increasingly compound events. That means concurrent heat waves and droughts, fire, but also compound flooding. Something that we witnessed earlier last year in the summer, where, for example, Central Europe was affected by deadly floods and unprecedented precipitation, while Southern Europe was shaken by heat waves. And not only, of course, Southern Europe, it spanned Australia, it spanned the North America, etc. And the window for action is rapidly closing. This was also a very important statement that Sonja made in the last webinar. Even a world at 1.5 degrees is not safe, but it is the best option we have. And here, and this quote, I would like to take as a point for departure for our first speaker. Professor Christian Huggel from the University of Zurich. So he works at the Department for Geography and is a lead author not only of this assessment cycle, but already also of the last one. His research interests are climate impacts, risks, and adaptation to climate change in mountain areas, strengthening the intersection of science and international climate policy, and with a strong regional focus on the Andes, the Alps, and the Himalayas. And he will now share his findings on on the key messages, or he will share the key messages of the latest IPCC report. The floor is yours, Christian.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jana, and welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you and bring to you the key messages of the new IPCC report, which was released some weeks ago, Working Group 2. Next slide, please. The report, as you know, the IPCC has a global scope. So my key messages are mostly on the global level, but of course the report also has important information at the regional scales, and there are different regional chapters such as from Europe, from Asia, from Central South America, Africa, etc. And you probably are interested also to look into these chapters. Now, good. Where are we? We are at 1.1 degree warming in comparison to pre-industrial level. And this warming has already had wide-ranging consequences for billions of people. For example, climate extreme events can now increasingly be attributed to human-induced climate change. And this has had severe consequences for people and infrastructure. Another example is that 50% of the world's population already now face seasonal water scarcity actually every year. And more than 50% of the urban population are affected by climate change in terms of for their lives, for their livelihoods, and their health. And the report has assessed that more than 3 billion people, and these people are mainly in the developing world, are highly vulnerable to climate change. I indicate the below the figures in the SPM. I guess you have access to the SPM, otherwise maybe we can then share the link. The SPM is the summary for policymaker. Because some of these figures in the SPM are quite complex, and it's in very few minutes, it's not so easy to bring them to you. Now for the future, we have the, yeah, this is, you can stay on this, Jana. on the PowerPoint. For the future, the warming levels higher than 1.5 degrees, this means that risks multiply. And I would just very briefly remind us about the warming temperature scenarios, which you see on the right side. You can see here the different warming scenarios, and these are now for the AR6. They are indicated as SSP 1, 2, and then 1.9, 2.6. The first term SSP, these are the shared socioeconomic pathways from 1 to 5, where 1 is a more sustainable world and 5 less, and there are ways in between. And the numbers, second numbers, these are the representative concentration pathways. These are the radiative forcing. And you see that 1.9 is basically the one scenario that is in line with a 1.5 degree warming. It extends to almost 5 degree warming. And this also means this is just global warming. And you know that in many regions, warming is much higher than the global average. So what it means, the better we can mitigate warming towards low warming levels, and the more we can strengthen adaptive capacity and resilience, the more risks are reduced and we can avoid losses and damages. As an example, the risk of species extinction increases by a factor of 10 when we go from a warning level from 1.5 to 3 degree. And 3 degree would be around SSP to 4.5. With a 2.5 degree warming, the risk of heat waves, for instance, increased by a factor of 16, and more than 2 billion people be exposed to risk of dengue. Further, by 2050, 1 billion people will be exposed to risks related to sea level rise at coastal areas. Next slide, please. To bring you here some of the key graphics, on the left-hand side, we have the quite famous reasons for concerns or burning amber. So you see how these warming scenarios translate into risks. And those reasons for concerns, they are traditionally distinguished between 5 of them. I don't go into detail in every of them, but we have, for instance, reasons for concern 1 are the unique and threatened systems, such as ecosystems. And you see the color indicates the level of risk, where yellow is moderate and then red is already high risk. And you see the warming level. You can see, for instance, for unique and threatened systems already at 1.5 degree, we are in high to very high risk conditions. For extreme weather events as well, we are already at 1.5, we are in high risk levels. Large scale, the number 5, large scale singular events, these are the real big ones, like, for instance, collapse of ice sheets or the collapse of the Gulf Stream or Arctic permafrost, or also the Amazon, the transformation of the Amazon forest. And this brings me to the right side, an example of key risk for one region, for Central and South America. Maybe some of you are certainly working also in this region. We have certain sub-regions. Those are the official IPCC regions. I take, for instance, Central America, which is a very highly vulnerable and highly affected region by climate change, where you can see key risks which we had identified are related to to food insecurity, to floods and landslides, to water scarcity, and to epidemics. Further, also the coral reefs in Central America are at very high risks. Next slide, please. A very important aspect also in the report are that risks become increasingly complex and occur in parallel, which makes them increasingly difficult to manage. Actually, for the first time now, complex and interconnected risks which go across national borders and economic sectors were assessed. And the result is that they are significantly more severe than thought so far. Well, I can say that climate risks and weather extremes damage important infrastructure, example, ports, to ship goods and supply, and they disrupt supply chains. They threaten food security with large impacts on population and trade market, on supply and costs. And I think during the pandemic and also with the war in Ukraine, we very obviously see how things are connected and how severe the consequences are of when non-climatic crisis overlay with climatic crisis. And I think this is actually coming more the norm, and it's one of the really big concerns. Now, just one thing about mountain regions. Colleen Veruska will go in more detail, but just let me mention that mountain regions are particularly exposed to cascading climate impacts and risks. And this has strong effects on settlement, on mountain communities, local population, but also on energy production, on agriculture, small scale, and also large-scale agriculture, tourism, and of course, sustainable development in mountains, and not only in mountains, but also in lowland region. Now, the next slide. The report has done extensive assessment of adaptation around the world. So we've seen what's ongoing in terms of adaptation, and this has been systematically assessed. Sort of the good news is that in all sectors and regions, adaptation options and measures are available. Very important, and we often talk about the joint climate and biodiversity crisis, and it's not one against another, it's actually together. So it's much more effective to address climate change and biodiversity jointly. Very important, I think, for policymakers, that systematic planning of climate adaptation now is much easier and much more cost efficient and effective than if we do retrofitting. And just to give you a sense of, I mean, there are so many adaptation measures, of course, possible and also evaluated. I just will give you, for reasons of tangibility, for instance, we can mention protection, conservation, recovery of ecosystem, and there the report makes a clear statement that we need something like 30 to 50% of the surface area needs to go under conservation and protection. Or we have greening in urban areas. We have sustainable management of wetland areas, mountains and coastal areas. Multi-purpose schemes on energy production and irrigation and many other things. Or participative and joint knowledge production processes with affected people. The improvement of basic needs and services in rural areas, and also carefully planned retreat and relocation of people. Next slide. With higher levels of warming, adaptation measures become ineffective, and we are hitting limits of adaptation. Limits of adaptation is also one of the concepts and subjects that have been now received much more attention in the report. So despite many adaptation efforts, there's an increasing adaptation gap we've seen vis-a-vis ongoing climate change. We could say a key statement is that we are not on track in adaptation. This is not only true for mitigation, where we are not on track, we are also not on track with adaptation. Parts of population and ecosystems, such as in mountains and oceans, have already reached limits of adaptation. Coral reefs, for instance, are an example, but also people, local, highly vulnerable people. With higher levels of warming, several adaptation measures are no longer effective or simply are no longer possible. So one of the consequences that large-scale retreat and relocation will become unavoidable, in particular with high levels of warming. Next slide. So the consequence for that, what the report says, is that massive efforts and investments, financial investments, are necessary to avoid strongly increasing losses and damages. The report also makes a very strong point that we need to go much more to transformational adaptation. Much of what we have done so far is incremental adaptation. We need to move towards transformation, and it is more urgent than thought. And the final, also very important message is there is also a time window, not only for mitigation of climate change, but also for adaptation. And it's about the 10 next years that are critical to do actions to if we want to strongly if we want to avoid strongly increasing losses and damage. So remember this 10-year window. That's all. Thank you very much. And yes, later we see opportunity for question and answers.
Thank you very much, Christian. Actually, we have time for a brief round of questions, as this presentation was already very rich in insights, and I'm certain that with your respective backgrounds, there might already be questions, and we will not keep them for the end of the meeting. So if there are questions that you already have, feel free to post them in the chat. I am monitoring the chat, so Beatrice is asking, what is it that we are seeing on the last slide? So the slide that's currently on screen.
Yeah, thanks. Good question. It's say that's from the IPCC picture analysis. I can check for you. I think it's a restoration of coastal wetland area, but I can check in detail. I think that's what I mentioned. Yeah. I can check if you like.
Actually, if you feel more comfortable, you can also signal that you would like to speak, and then you can also directly speak. There's one more question. Can you give examples of adaptation being impossible with warming exceeding 2 degrees?
Yes, sure. For instance, one of the examples is where we have the coral reefs that are basically, between 1.5 degree already now. Many of them are lost. 1.5 degree is another important threshold, and 2 degrees. So for the coral reefs, there is no real adaptation possible. Of course, then you can see to see what level of the sort of cascade of the impact. So you can see, for instance, coral reefs. You see the livelihoods that are, for instance, depending on fishery. In coral reefs, there is still adaptation possible, for instance, diversification of livelihoods. Or, for instance, another example are glaciers. There we have seen that, for instance, with in some regions, with 1.5 degrees, you can preserve or save something like 50% of the glaciers. In other regions, that might be slightly different. With higher level of warming, most of the glaciers in many mountain regions might be lost. So we don't have, there's not much to make. We can, of course, then this has important consequences on, for instance, water resources, especially in dry regions, seasonally dry regions where glacial meltwater is an important contributor. And there you need to see what in terms of, for instance, improved water management is possible. So I think it's important to see, and even you can say, for instance, habitability is one of the big things. And if you can say if floods or different extreme events hit in a frequency or in a magnitude that is just too high, people may decide or may need to relocate. But of course, and I think this is also important to say, that these limits of adaptation are something that is currently under research. It's something that where the report has made an important contribution, but this is really also in an area of further research. So try not to be too long to catch a few questions. Next one, I see which one, the next one. How does the IPCC define transformative adaptation, and what would be examples? Yeah, what we have seen, I mean, incremental to be quite concrete, incremental, for instance, versus transformative. So incremental would, for instance, be for floods, you would build a dam, for instance, a retention dam. This would be something like incremental. If you go to transformation, I mean, what would be really transformational is, for instance, relocation. So you can have a flood situation, like incremental would be building a dam, transformative would be relocating people, or sometimes it can also be transformative, can be just to diversify the livelihoods of people or go towards different jobs. So Jana, you tell me, I don't know whether how many questions you can take, you just tell me, right?
Yeah, I'm looking at the questions, and I think some of them, they might also be suitable for the end. So I'm noting them down so they do not get lost. Maybe one last question. How is this going to affect the ability to adapt for droughts or to droughts if the 1.5 degrees Celsius bar is breached? So yeah, limits to adaptation regarding droughts beyond 1.5 degree warming.
So the question is, if we go higher than 1.5 degree, to what extent we can still adapt to drought? I think this very much depends on first on the climatic and environmental context where we are located, and then very much on the social, political, economic, financial context. So what are people depending on? Is it, are they depending on, like, for instance, certain crops that are highly vulnerable to drought conditions? How fast are they able to adapt, maybe incrementally or to transformative changes? So the ability to adapt is usually very much, I mean, of course, there are climatic, environmental boundary conditions, but then this comes very much down to the societies, to the social aspects, political aspects, financial aspects, to the knowledge, of course. This is something you know very well, how important the knowledge is to act. So thank you very much for the questions. Very good questions, by the way.
I see one question that I think we can take now, and all the others I would like to postpone to a later stage. And the question is, what do you plan to get this message across? Of course, the other speakers can also unmute, to get this message across into the public, as time of the publication was not ideal due to the outbreak of the war in Ukraine. So what's also your take on the uptake of this report and how to get the message across?
I mean, it depends. There are different outlets. Of course, there's the general public, then there's policy level. There are many experts, like here in this audience. Depends. For instance, in Switzerland, we are currently in a really intensive effort to have an exchange early May, to have an exchange with the national parliament, where we really discuss with members of the parliament the report and try to bring over the key messages and look with them. There are many media outlets. Of course, it was the war in Ukraine pushed the IPCC. I think the first 2-3 days was very strong, but then the sort of the war pushed it out of the news. So I think there's really, and this has greatly increased also from earlier reports, that the way how things are communicated has improved, and I think have also strongly strengthened. But it's also very important, like this event here, so that people can have a feeling on the understanding of what's in the report.
Okay, thank you so much, Christian, and you stay with us. So there's another chance for asking questions, and I collect every question that is asked in between. So now, with a little bit of delay, I would like to introduce our next two speakers that will take you to a deep dive to the cross-chapter paper on mountains. First, Carolina Adler, who is the Executive Director of the Mountain Research Initiative and also associated with the University of Bern. And I am sorry, so the first two bullet points, the first bullet point is still from Christian's slide, but Carolina, as said, she was lead author of the special report and Ocean of Oceans, and of course also lead author in the current assessment report cycle. And her research interests are linking climate change adaptation and policies for sustainable development. So a very clear stance on transdisciplinary research, interdisciplinary research, how to use and how to uptake the scientific evidence in policy and decision making. And I'm very glad that we can have you here today. And I would also like to introduce Veruska Muccione from the University of Zurich, who's senior scientist at the Department of Geography. Unlike the others who are trained geographers and environmental engineers, she's astrophysicist, and her research interests are to work on climate change impacts, risk and vulnerability, global change in biodiversity, and integrated risk assessments, and I believe also attribution to climate change of specific events. But this will not be the focus of today. And with this, I would like to hand over to them. Give me just a second to start the presentation.
No problem at all. Thank you very much, Jana.
Yes.
While we wait for the slides to come up, just a very brief comment regarding the last question, which I thought was also very interesting and pertinent given the times in which we're living. Indeed, the geopolitical situation is something to bear in mind, not only in how we address the key messages of this report, but also what this means for international cooperation and the relationships that we need to be building at the global level to support not only the objectives that we seek to address for climate change, but also human dignity and human rights more broadly. Just last week I was in, or the week before rather, I was at a side event presenting the IPCC outcomes to a side event at the high at the Human Rights Council that we're meeting still meeting in Geneva, in fact. And that conversation was very much around the parallels, if you like, between climate change, addressing climate change imperative, and also defending human rights all around the world, and particularly in regions that are facing conflict and social conflict at the moment. So although it does seem like it takes away some of the attention, at least from a media perspective and media attention perspective, I think this is a dialogue that is very much present in many of the decision-making contexts, at least that I'm aware of, and this is important to maintain as we move forward. I believe the slides are now up. Jana, would you mind putting them in presentation mode?
Trouble opening them. Could you share your screen? Is that possible?
I've also shared
for this presentation.
I've also shared the PDF version. That's usually easier to load, and rather
maybe
than
we try that one.
PowerPoint. Yeah.
Okay.
And as Jana manages to put the slides up, one other thing that I would like to mention, much of what Christian showed was in relation to the main findings of the entire report of the Working Group 2 contribution to the 6th assessment. And one of the key innovations that were trialed in the 6th assessment for the first time is what's called the cross-chapter papers, which is an attempt to try and synthesize key information and key findings from across the different regional and sectoral chapters into those particular areas of particular interest, for example, mountains. So much of what we also present here today between Veruska and myself, what we've managed to synthesize in the cross-chapter paper, mountains more specifically. And I believe we're about
I don't manage to get it on full screen.
Shall I try? Here is Veruska.
Yes, it would be great. I'm really sorry. It worked before.
You have to give me. You have to give me right to share the screen. Actually, you have to stop sharing, and I can share. Okay, good. I try. Yeah, let's see if it works.
So no matter how long we're into the pandemic and virtual collaboration, it still happens. Our apologies.
It's a team effort. But what I also wanted to mention is that in addition to having to synthesize evidence from across the report that relates to mountains into the cross-chapter paper, Veruska and I also were involved with our respective chapters. So we also were designated our home chapters, as we call them. In my case, chapter 17 on decision-making options for managing risks. So this is more in line with the type of work that I also carry out in policy sciences. And I believe we are now fine to proceed. Thank you very much for that, Veruska. Next slide, please. So one key thing to highlight from the 6th assessment in comparison to the 5th assessment, which was published in 2013 already, is that we are now looking at climate change within a context of much more complex interconnections and understandings about how these interconnections not only reinforce each other, but also provide us with a much richer context in which climate-related risks, impacts and risks are now unfolding. So this is an assessment that's based on new understandings of these interactions, where we can no longer afford to think in silos, and we have to look across climate, biodiversity and human society more generally, and the well-being that affects both people and ecosystems everywhere, if we want to handle and tackle the many global challenges that we face today. So this degree of complexity, of course, means that we also need to look into many diverse evidence inputs, if you like, from different contexts, not just climate change and climate-related scientific publications, but also how ecosystems and biodiversity is being affected, and also the human dimensions. And one thing that I would like to also highlight here is the framing that the IPCC utilizes in how we describe climate impacts and climate risks, which is about how people are exposed to certain related hazards and the vulnerabilities that underpin also the degree of susceptibility to damage and to loss in the context of climate impact or risk materializing. So this risk framework, if you like, is something that I would like to touch upon a little bit later in this presentation. And this level of understanding and interconnections is, of course, something that is also prevalent in the type of evidence we've seen for impacts in mountain regions more specifically. Next slide, please. So which mountain regions are we talking about? So Jana already mentioned the fact that I was also involved as a lead author in the special report on the ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate, or SROC, which was published and endorsed by the panel in 2019. And that chapter had a specific chapter on high mountain areas, and specifically looking at the way in which the cryosphere, this is the ice and snow parts or components of the mountain system, how they are responding to changes in climate, in particular, for instance, in the context of temperature. However, in this particular report, the cross-chapter paper mountains takes mountains in a much broader sense. So not just looking at those regions that have a cryosphere component to them, but also mountain regions where seasonal snow is also a major part of that ecosystem, and also the interactions and links with lowland regions. So this means that the global mountain region that we defined or delineated for this assessment comprise almost 24% of the global land surface. This is excluding the polar regions, which received a specific designated section within the report. And in total, this means that we are talking roughly 1.28 billion people that reside in mountain regions and or nearby. And this is based on statistics that we managed to come across for the year 2015. So quite a significant proportion of the global population lives and depends on mountain regions worldwide. Next slide, please. So these are the complex SPM or summary for policymakers figures that Christian also made reference to. What is important to recognize is that the summary for policymakers is a fundamental document that is not only useful for how we condense and bring together key findings from across the report for policymakers, but is often the only report that's actually read or taken into consideration, for instance, for climate negotiations and negotiators more broadly. And so it was really important for us to make sure that we also have a means to synthesize and highlight the key findings from the cross-chapter paper, but also other chapters into the summary for policymakers. So it was quite a significant amount of work for those of us who were involved in the drafting of the summary for policymakers, and making sure that those findings are also respected and taken into account when governments themselves also negotiate the wording of the SPM key messages. So just to give you a sense of this particular figure, and this is just to present some of the key impacts that we've been able to observe in many ecosystems and human systems around the world. So this is a two-part panel figure, if you like. This is panel A, which talks about the observed impacts of climate change on ecosystems. And as you can see at the bottom, there's a row highlighting mountain regions where we were able to highlight some of those key impacts. And one of the key ones is with respect to the level of confidence that we have in the evidence assessed, is that changes in the ecosystem structure and species range shift. So for instance, cold adapted species having to gradually move further upslope onto higher ground in mountain regions being already observed. And this is something that we can say with high confidence, as well as the changing in the timing, the phenology for many species. For instance, when the seasons for flowering or the seasons for certain crops to be able to develop. This is also some of the key things that we've been able to ascertain with a higher degree of confidence compared to earlier assessments. And this means it's not only evident in the number of studies that are available, but also with respects to more robust and rigorous climate change related studies that also consider how the attribution associated with those changes to human induced influence. So this is also something that we've been able to increase over the years. Next slide, please. And the second panel talks a little bit more about the implications of the observed impacts on human systems. So next slide. We have here on the left-hand side, one less, sorry. That was a bit quick. Yep. So that's one of the columns, if you like, that summarizes, for instance, the impacts on water scarcity and fruit production. And as you can see, for water scarcity, this is something that is prevalent in the evidence assessed for mountain regions. But the changes that we are observing go both ways, positive and negative. And this is because of the seasonal aspect of when water is available from the mountain, from mountain contexts, but also given that some regions are still reaching peak water at different times. So this is also the complexity, I suppose, in bringing evidence that is aggregated at the global scale. So this is why some of these figures are quite complex in being able to disentangle to its individual elements. But nonetheless, the picture that is painted here is precisely one that talks about the importance of water, for instance, given that the impacts that we are observing are already quite significant. Also in relation to human health and well-being, one of the key things that we've been able to look into in the evidence assessed is, for instance, impacts to mental health, which is something that is also emerging in the literature since the last assessment in 2013. And this is increasingly becoming an area of important, not only research, but also I would imagine also for practitioners such as yourselves in dealing with communities that are also addressing and experiencing much loss and damage as part of the climate related impacts that they're already experiencing. So this is also an important area perhaps to look into and increase our rigor in terms of the evidence available to look into that. And finally, the next slide, please, sorry. This is on impacts on cities, settlements and infrastructure. The evidence is also quite clear. There's quite a lot of significant amount of literature available that points to losses and damages and having a negative effect in mountain regions specifically. So this is something that my colleague Veruska will look into more details in relation to risks into the future. But just to say that what we are already observing at 1.1 degrees is already given us a very strong indication that the urgency to address and limit warming to less than 1.5 degrees is certainly something that speaks for mountain regions very strongly. Next slide, please. So just to give you some of the key messages, if you like, from the observed climate change, this is just a summary of some of the key messages. The cross-chapter paper, of course, deals with many other topics. But just to say that climate change impacts and their attribution to human influence have certainly increased. There are observable and serious consequences for people and ecosystems in many mountain regions. So this is something that we can ascertain. Second is that 2/3 of irrigated agriculture is dependent on water from mountain sources. And due to the variability that we're now seeing in terms of the timing of glacier and snowmelt increasingly affecting people and economies, and also a case to be said about how these conditions also exacerbate conflicts over water resources in seasonally dry regions. And this is something that many of you no doubt have firsthand experiences in dealing with the communities you work with. And the third one is on the observed changes in the seasonality. Mountains are very seasonal in themselves. And therefore, the changes in the seasons have negatively affected other sectors of livelihoods that take part in mountains, for instance, in tourism, for example, in particular, in this case, winter tourism. While exposure to climate-related hazards such as flash floods and landslides are contributing to an increase in disasters affecting a growing number of people in mountain regions and further downstreams. So the observed impact is something that cannot be ignored. This is very strongly reported on as part of the evidence assessed. Next slide, please. And why is this important to take note of? Because, for instance, in the context of water, and this is one of the figures that comes out of the cross-chapter paper, mountains, it is important to recognize that the changes that we are now seeing in water availability affect people and ecosystems in many mountain regions. And we already have highlighted in the report pockets of not only where water is important and where water from mountain sources are particularly dependent for some communities, But it's also important to recognize the downstream regions. And in most cases, what we're seeing is that the extent of the importance of water and the dependence of mountain for water sources is in many cases essential and definitely insufficient in the way in which those are available to people. Next slide, please. Likewise, as I mentioned, the pockets of lowland populations that are dependent on mountain water resources. And this is not only based on the trends that we've been able to observe up to 2014, but more importantly, their projections into the future. Next slide, please. And what I would like to highlight here is that not only are the changes in water availability important to take into account for the future, but also the way in which our demographics are also changing into the future, and therefore the demand for water that we can expect to see into the future also overlapping with water scarcity situation. One of the key things that we've been able to show in the cross-chapter paper is the dependence of lowland populations, but also how that population is expected to grow into the future. So we have a very precarious situation in which to not only look into the impacts that make water availability an issue, but also the intersecting with human dimensions, such as the expected population growth into the future. And with that, speaking of future, I would like to now hand over to my colleague Veruska, who will talk in more detail about what we can expect into the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Carolina. I hope you can hear me and see me well. We have some internet connection problem, but it should work now. Okay, yes, so we look into the future, taking over from the observed impact. Also, as Carolina already introduced, I was also part of this cross-chapter paper on mountains, and my own chapter was the chapter Europe. So we will see into the future all the changes, all the changes that, or the impact that you have seen in the previous presentation from Carolina will continue into the future. And so we expect negative consequences for mountain cryosphere, so the frozen part of the mountains, for biodiversity, ecosystem services, and human well-being. Of course, with difference depending on the regions. So in a nutshell here, I summarize the projected impact already at 1.5 degree of warming, and also beyond 1.5 degree. So what we see into the future, it confirms also the findings from the special report on ocean and cryosphere that many low elevation and small glacier will lose most of their mass if for a warming at 1.5, and also temporarily exceeding this 1.5 degrees might have irreversible, might lead to irreversible changes. For example, mountaintop species will be at increasing risk of extinction by exceeding 1.5 degrees, as I said, even temporarily in a so-called overshoot scenario. And region relying again on glacier and snow melt already face erratic water supplies, but this impact will intensify, and as we say, it's already happening now, so it's already irreversible. Also damages and losses, in particular from water related hazards, as for example floods and landslide happening separated, but also often these happen together, so with the risks compounding each other. You have heard this word compound also from the working group 1. So this will increase considerably between 1.5 and 3 degrees. So if we look at the globally, not just for mountains, this is a global number, the projected increase in direct flood damage will go from 2.5, between 2.5 and 3 times, almost 4 times higher at 3 degrees of warming compared to 1.5. So Christian already introduced this word key risks and also this burning ambers diagram. So what the IPCC does is to pull together evidence from different studies. This could be long-term observation, modeling studies. So from this multiple line of evidence, we translate impact in a so-called risk language, where risk is the potential for adverse consequences for human and natural systems. So in the working group 2, we assessed 130 key risks globally, and for the mountains we have 4 key risks which were assessed and fed into this 130 key risk for the final key risk assessment. And this key risk was also pulled together using expert elicitation and expert judgment to understand the level of severity of these risks. And as Christian already said, the severity, we use this so-called burning amber or traffic light system, where we characterize the risk going from white, where it's undetectable, or yellow, where the risk has already appeared, it's already been observed and attributed, and then where the risk goes red, which imply the risk being high, so being based on the magnitude, but also on irreversibility, the timing of the risk appearing sooner rather than later, and going to very high when there is also the ability to adapt is limited on top of all the rest. So for mountains, we have identified these 4 key risks, which you might have got a hint already from previous presentation that on the observed impact, these future risks will be related to the loss of lives, harm to people, and damage from to infrastructure from landslide and flood. The second one has to do mostly with the water scarcity to multiple systems. The third is about loss of species or species extinction, and the fourth is related to intangible losses and the harm to people from loss of cultural value, but also from increasing disaster. Here I just show one figure that we have pulled together, where it shows the different regional differences in terms of this color. Here we show already the risks that are already moderate at different degree of warming. So you see from like low warming level, we see up to 1.7, medium warming level, sorry, this is here is the second bar, and the third bar is the high warming level. So you could see some regional hotspot here that already at, let's say, low warming level, let's say below 2 degrees, they already being characterized by high risks. If you look at this region, these are so-called IPCC regions, so they are climatological region. But if you look at this aggregated by continent, you also see a similar patterns which is mainly characterized by specific hotspot in Asia, but also in Africa and Central South America. And you also see the characteristic of the specific hazard that characterize these different key risks from flood and landslide. So what do we mean by risks? Risks is usually, in the context of these key risks, is related to severe consequences. So the severe consequences, just some example that we pull out of the literature. I have it here. For example, we see a 2-fold average increase in the number of people exposed to inland flooding between 2 degrees and 4 degrees, and the highest increase is in this hotspot region that I indicated. We also see that by mid-century, 50–100% of the lowland population is projected to become water stressed in regions that are already largely dependent or dependent on largely insufficient share of fresh water. And again, you see which are these this region, just for highlight those. We also see that the underlying condition that contribute to these key risks or this risk becoming severe are not just the hazard per se, which is related, of course, to physical changes in the climate, but also the exposure, so the increasing number of people in this exposed location, as we see also from the previous presentation, that we expect a growing number of people according to certain population scenario, and also the vulnerability or limited capacity to adapt. In the next slide, we have also assessed the extent of adaptation implemented and being planned in mountains. And it's a bit of a complex figure, but what you can take is just that the adaptation as it is now in mountain region is largely insufficient to address future key risks. And this in particular for warming level beyond 1.5 degrees. And we see this in all regions. We characterize this adaptation needed or extent of adaptation based on the speed that the time frame with which adaptation is happening, the scope, so how big it is, how intersectoral or transboundary this is, and also the depth. So when it's really reflecting a change, and this goes a bit in the direction of transformative adaptation. So with warming above 1.5 degrees, the need for adaptation becomes urgent. But what we see is that we are not on track on that, at least in general and in mountains as well. And therefore, we are not on track to achieve a climate resilient, sustainable world, because we also observe this big adaptation gap. We have assessed a number of measures that are effective to reduce risks in mountains. And we see that most of these are those that are robust under uncertain future. So they allow for adaptive planning, and they also incorporate the concern of all the interested actors and their value. For example, we have here ecosystem-based adaptation that address both biodiversity, but is also address, for example, protection against flood or multi-purpose water reservoir. Again, regional cooperation and transboundary governance enable this long-term action to reduce risks that goes beyond jurisdiction and boundaries. And in mountains, this is really important because most of the risks are cascading, are large, wide-ranging. But again, the ability to adapt reduce with every small increase of warming. And also the scope and option to achieve climate resilient and sustainable development at the same time becomes more limited at 2 degrees, and in particular in regions such as mountains, and almost impossible if warming exceeds 2 degrees. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Veruska and Carolina, for this very rich presentation. I have to say it doesn't make me very optimistic when we see where we are standing regarding the key risks and where we are standing when it comes to adaptation. I am now sharing my screen again so that we can continue with the overview and also get your questions again to these presentations. And I think like in the last webinar, I like to go with the cartoons that were published by the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center in collaboration with international cartoonists. So they refer to the IPCC at the Atlas of Doom, so now we know what to expect, which is great in a way. But now we also, of course, would like to go beyond that knowledge and get our feet and hands into action. Are there any questions? Any new questions? Otherwise, I would go back to the questions that were already asked. Let me just get back to them again. So we had a couple of questions that looked at, let's say, the synergies between adaptation and mitigation options, and I'm picking one of them. Shouldn't we rather look for solutions that do adaptation and mitigation at the same time rather than looking at them separately? And I'm leaving it open to one of the three speakers who would like to address this question. or also Rupa, if you feel like you can contribute at the moment.
I'm happy to just very briefly chime in there. Absolutely. This mainstreaming of options to address both adaptation and mitigation are certainly not mutually exclusive. They certainly reinforce each other and should reinforce each other, particularly for when we are seeking to avoid maladaptive practices. And maladaptation is also a concept that was highlighted a fair bit, not just in the literature we've assessed, but also within the context of the key messages of this report. For instance, there was also an earlier question around the prospects of making sure that adaptation is effective. And one of the key things for us to remind ourselves is that the window of opportunity for adaptation is certainly much bigger if we can limit warming to 1.5, because much of what we are advocating for adaptation that would work in the mountain context is nature-based solutions and ecosystem-based adaptation. But those particular solutions can only be expected to be effective under conditions of lower warming compared to higher warming levels. Therefore, it's indispensable that adaptation and mitigation go hand in hand to ensure the greatest window of opportunity for adaptation more generally to be successful and effective in the types of outcomes that we are seeking to address.
Thank you, Carolina. Rupa, you can.
Thanks, Jana. And the question inspired me to speak up. So to complement what Carolina said, what the report also provides substantial evidence for is the importance of combining adaptation mitigation with development choices that we make. So every development choice or opportunity is also an opportunity to reduce risks through a focus on mitigation, the choices we make, but also avoid creating new risks. So maladaptation or locking ourselves into investments, and often they're investments with longer life, that reduce choices for the future. So at the request of policymakers, this report has a particular chapter on climate resilient development, and all the regional and sectoral chapters have also looked at the evidence of making choices that can contribute to multiple benefits. And there's quite some examples of adaptation options which also have developmental outcomes that contribute to sustainable development. So there are lots of synergies, but not to paint too rosy a picture, there are also trade-offs. And I think these trade-offs need to be discussed in an objective manner. So the report also looks at feasibility of climate resilient development options, feasibility of the transitions. It talks about 5 system transitions, and what are the enabling conditions for it. And the only reason this assessment was possible is that there's growing literature to review and assess. Yeah.
Thank you, Rupa. I take this as a nice transition. You mentioned the adaptation priorities, and this leads me to the question that we asked you. And before we continue with the Q&A, I would like to bring up that word cloud again. So I stop sharing my screen and would ask Gloria, excellent, to show us the word cloud that you generated as participants. So what should be the priorities for effective adaptation, we asked, and your answers can be, I also read it now for the first time, so give me a second. I read many keywords that were already mentioned by our speakers, like nature-based solutions, ecosystem-based adaptation, I assume, linking biodiversity and adaptation, as these are climate and biodiversity crises are closely linked. But I also, of course, I'm looking also at this. I also see disaster risk management, disaster risk reduction, as important approaches to strengthen adaptation, and maybe also to overcome or to address the limits of adaptation, where we cannot, in areas, be it sectors, be it geographical areas, where the limits of adaptations are soon to be reached, what is the role then of managing the risk of extremes, of preparedness, of early warning, and also know that the report highlighted the need for early warning systems basically across every chapter. But apart from that, also very general, but not less strong notes here: a knowledge of risk, an understanding of risks, agriculture that is geared towards resilience, finance flows, population dynamics, and communication. So it's very broad, but that probably, you can correct me, but this probably also reflects that there is not one way to go, but that we need to continue and strengthen our strong commitments in diverse directions, but in a more interlinked way to ensure effectiveness. This is one major take that I personally also take from the report. And so we are gladly also sharing this word cloud after the event when we document the webinar. Thank you, Gloria. So I think that we can continue with questions and answers. I do not see new ones, so let me get back to
Jana, maybe I want to add something on the word cloud. I always like to see there. Maybe one thing that when we talk really about effectiveness, so effectiveness is also really understood as, the capacity or the ability of adaptation to reduce risks. I think it's important to monitor adaptation. So we have to understand the baseline, and we have to understand what progress we have made. So I think this is also something we see in the priority of the report is monitoring the effectiveness of adaptation, which is at the moment, is something that's really needed.
Thank you, Veruska. So let me see. We addressed most of the question. There's one question that's related to the prospects of this urgency of the report when we frame it with the latest or the last COPs that we had. Are we already late with all of it, having in mind that the same arguments we are hearing for already a few years, and policymakers that more or less have not taken action, have ignored the warnings? So you mentioned that the window of opportunity, or the window for potential change, is closing quickly. What can we still do? How optimistic are you, being very well versed with the science and also in dialogue with policymakers?
If my colleagues, I would like to also give them a chance to comment, but me personally, I would say I'm still quite an optimist, because much of what we've assessed indicates that there is adaptation action, there is implementation going on, and there are results being gathered that certain actions are addressing the needs and opportunities for people to also thrive in the context, irrespective of whether this is a climate-specific related action or not. Much of what I would imagine many of you do as in your NGO work as practitioners goes in this direction. And one of the things that I would like to highlight is also the importance for these collaborations to continue to proliferate into the future. One thing that Veruska mentioned, which is very important, is the monitoring of adaptation, not only as we implement it, but whether that implementation is having the results we are seeking to fulfill. And those collaborations are not just to do with scientific research, and for us to be able to document those successes in publications for the IPCC to assess. I think it's important also for relationships to expand with practitioners and local communities in a transdisciplinary sense, so that we continue to reinforce the knowledge systems that would allow us to continue to provide these policy relevant messages for implementation to continue to be supported. Yes, the window of opportunity is closing, but the opportunity is still there. And as Christian also mentioned right at the beginning, then what we do in the next decade and precisely what we start doing as of today significantly matters in our ability to reduce risks for people. So it is important to keep that in mind, that it's not too late to reduce or potentially avert the worst case scenario if we start acting as of today.
And I think this is probably one message, despite being heard for many years, which still needs to be shared again and again. We are now...
Jana, yeah, maybe
Yeah.
just to add, to be honest, I think we need to rethink adaptation. What we currently see, I think, is really a move to more critical conditions. And this is not just the pandemic now, the war in Ukraine, but I think the adaptation we have seen so far is mostly incremental. We've seen that, and we need to move towards more transformation. This is coming out of the report, but I think actually the reality is sort of, sometimes I feel the reality is overtaking us. And what we see are these, I mentioned as a key message, these interconnected risks. And I have the feeling that they actually become the norm. You see, for instance, the war in Ukraine and the big, I mean, all the tragedy, terrible things, but also the consequences it has, for instance, on food security worldwide. And I think these type of interconnections are now playing out more and more. We have multiple crises we need to manage, and this is highly challenging. I'm basically optimistic, but I really think we have to rethink adaptation. It's just not enough if people, and also here in Switzerland and many other parts, they think, okay, we do a little bit of whatever, an early warning system, which is very valuable, used as well. But I think what we have to think is in terms of systems and how we make our system resilient. And I think actually it's not so much only climate change. It's all the crises are interconnected, and we clearly see that. A war in Ukraine is also an energy crisis. It's also a food security crisis. And look, imagine now we have a drought or whatever extreme events hitting, then this comes on top of it. These are these interconnected compound risks, and we need to find a way, and we need to find it quickly, how we deal with such type of crisis. And I think this is the real big challenge.
Thank you, Christian. And sorry, I don't see if I'm mute. No, I'm not mute. Good. So you mentioned you are engaging, for example, with the Swiss government on also conveying this kind of messages to bring this to the public, correct?
Yeah, this is something from the IPCC and IPBES, the biodiversity community, to sort of exchange with the parliament on these kind of things. But also in Switzerland, I think, I mean, of course, it's of course there's important challenges, for instance, for agriculture and from other areas. But what we see, what we are actually very much affected is by the international level. We cannot, sometimes in Switzerland, there's also this tendency to think like we can manage everything in Switzerland, but actually we are highly dependent as any other country on the international connections and crises. And we can no longer think also in terms of adaptation without seriously considering this international context and the trade flows and everything that is connected, that has an immense importance on not just on our well-being, but really on our basic needs.
Yes, hello.
I think there's a hand up, Jana.
Yeah,
James.
I just got note, yes, from my colleague. Yes, who would like to speak?
This is Hakim James.
Yes.
Yes, this is Hakim James representing Organic Farming Advisory Organization from South Sudan.
Thank you.
This is our first time to attend the webinar, and regarding all the climate changes issues discussed, actually it's the common changes also in South Sudan. So I'm very sorry, I'm in a quarantine place. I'm suffering from chicken pox, where I'm isolated from all my office, and I'm at home now somewhere.
Mm-hmm. Do
So,
you have a specific question to the speakers?
Actually, regarding this climate change program, it's just like an addition. It's everywhere. Like in South Sudan, currently we are hit by climate change issues. We are expecting a rain in March for planting, but completely we are having a heat throughout the season where a lot of issues are happening as conflict also continue hammering displacement. People are chased out from their land. You see livestock are coming to intervene also the farmland. There are a lot of issues regarding climate change measures in South Sudan as the adaptation, the mitigation and the adaptation also question asked there, how are they moving together? So in our perspective here, mitigation and the adaptation can go together, but now it needs more education in this program, like to other location. Now people have to be educated on the mitigation and the adaptation system so that we reduce the climate change in future, as we put one of the way there, the reduction of the climate change.
Okay, can I, thank you. Given the time, I need to stop you here. Have you formulated your question?
Yes, and just this is the view that I want to say.
You wanted to share, you do not want a specific answer.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Welcome.
Given the time, which is quite advanced, and I think that we could talk about it for much longer, and I think we should offer another opportunity to exchange where we focus really specifically on the development, climate resilient development pathways, where we are also trying to insert effective solutions or also promising approaches to bridge the gap between adaptation needs and adaptation or adaptation planning and implementation that is currently being done, but also how to address this interconnectedness of risk that Christian mentioned, and to work really with a systems approach that at the same side is also very practical and hands-on and goes beyond scientific discourse, because we know what is going to happen, we know what has happened and what is going to happen, but still our actions on both individual but also collective levels are lagging far behind. To close this webinar, I have a few questions just on your experience in this webinar, and we would again ask you to go back to the Menti page. I hope you can now see the screen again. I got a feedback that it was frozen. So the first question would be whether the web. My apologies. This was my internet that kicked me out. I hope you managed. So do you have suggestions for improvement of the webinar? As we saw that some participants the webinar met partially their expectations. Other commitments. Even more time for questions, I understand. Improve technical support, I understand, but sometimes the internet can also let you down, and no IT support would have helped, but I take this. Okay. Yes, great. I hear this as well. We will look to incorporate this in the next webinar. And Gloria, could you go to the next questions? Respectively, do you have suggestions for future learning opportunities by the DRR platform? And I take your time to fill this out. So we will also analyze this and account for that in the future. But I don't think that I need to stretch the time even further. Therefore, Gloria, could you stop sharing the screen, and I will take over for the final slide. Exactly. So planned is to continue this journey with the Working Group 3 report on mitigation of climate change. But I also think that there is still need for more discussion that is even more concretely centered around the climate resilient development pathways and concretely how climate change is already happening now and what are adaptation options that are promising to fill the gaps that are identified in the report. If you have, so more info can be found on the DRR platform. I will also share with everyone registered the moment when the recording is put up, and the presentations will be shared as well via the platform. You can also follow us diverse social media. And with this, I would like to thank you. Yeah, thank you for your patience and also looking after the challenges that we as organizers were also facing last minute. Thank you very much for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you so much. Bye.